January 17, 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The rain falls in sheets across the muddy field hospital, drumming against canvas tents stretched tight over bamboo frames. Inside, beneath the flicker of kerosene lamps, a Japanese soldier sits motionless on a wooden crate, his uniform torn and blood-stained, his hands trembling not from cold, but from something deeper, something he cannot name. He has been taught since childhood that capture means dishonor, worse than death. He has been told that the Americans are demons who torture and mutilate, that surrender is the final betrayal of the Emperor, of Japan, of everything sacred. And yet here he sits, alive, waiting for the inevitable cruelty that must come. An American medic approaches, boots squelching in the mud. The soldier flinches, closes his eyes, braces for the blow. Instead, he feels something soft pressed into his hands. He opens his eyes, a clean towel, a bar of white soap. The medic gestures toward a basin of warm water, then moves on to the next wounded man without a word, without violence, without hatred. The soldier stares at the soap in his palm as if it were a grenade. This moment, repeated in jungle clearings and field hospitals across the Pacific Theater, represents one of the most profound psychological earthquakes of the Second World War. For the Japanese soldier, raised in a culture where capture was unthinkable and the enemy was portrayed as subhuman, the reality of American treatment shattered not just military doctrine, but the very foundation of everything he had been taught to believe. The soap was not merely soap, it was a crack in the wall of an entire ideology. The architecture of indoctrination. To understand the shock these men experienced, one must first understand the system that shaped them. From the moment a Japanese boy entered military service, he was subjected to a relentless program of psychological conditioning that made surrender not merely dishonorable, but literally inconceivable. The Senjin-kun, the military field code issued in 1941, declared explicitly, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken alive." This was not guidance, this was divine command, reinforced by brutal discipline, by stories of ancestral warriors who chose suicide over capture, by a Shinto-influenced belief system that tied personal honor directly to service to the emperor. Japanese soldiers were told that Americans tortured prisoners, that they would be mutilated, humiliated, paraded through streets, subjected to horrors that made death preferable. These were not mere rumors, they were official military propaganda, reinforced through training films, officer lectures, and the testimony of soldiers who claimed to have witnessed American atrocities. The propaganda was so pervasive, so total, that by 1943 captured Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal reported that they believed Americans ate the flesh of their prisoners. They had been conditioned to see surrender as spiritual annihilation, a fate literally worse than death, and so they fought with a ferocity born of existential terror. On Saipan in June 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians chose mass suicide over capture, hurling themselves from cliffs into the sea below. On Okinawa in 1945, soldiers detonated grenades against their own chests rather than raise their hands. The few who were captured often tried to kill themselves afterward, or arrived at American lines convinced they would not live through the night. They expected torture. They received towels. The reality behind the wire. The first documented cases of Japanese prisoners expressing shock at their treatment came as early as Guadalcanal in late 1942. A captured naval infantryman, interrogated by American intelligence officers, reported that he had expected to be beaten, starved, and killed. Instead, he had been given medical treatment for his wounds, fed rations identical to what American soldiers ate, and allowed to rest. When asked why he seemed so confused, he reportedly said through a translator, "You treat us as if we are human beings." This was not isolated kindness, it was official American policy, rooted in adherence to the Geneva Convention, but also in a pragmatic understanding that well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence. But the psychological impact went far beyond military utility. For Japanese soldiers, the experience of receiving medical care, clean clothes, adequate food, and respectful treatment was so disorienting that many initially believed it was an elaborate deception, that the real torture would begin once they had been softened by false kindness. At POW camps across the Pacific and later in the continental United States, Japanese prisoners encountered a world that contradicted everything they had been told. They were issued clean uniforms, they were allowed to bathe regularly. They received 3 meals a day, more food than many had seen in months of jungle warfare. They were given soap, razors, toothbrushes, small dignities that their own military had ceased providing as supply lines collapsed and resources dwindled. Some prisoners, arriving emaciated and disease-ridden from island garrisons, gained 20 or 30 pounds in their first months of captivity. The soap became a symbol, white, rectangular, stamped with English letters they could not read. It represented something that went beyond hygiene. It represented a system that had the resources to care for its enemies, that valued cleanliness and human dignity even in the midst of total war. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to scarcity and brutal discipline, found themselves in a reality where their captors possessed such abundance that they could afford to waste it on prisoners. The records speak American military intelligence recognized early that humane treatment of prisoners was not merely ethical, but strategically valuable. A 1943 report from the Office of War Information noted, "Japanese prisoners, once convinced, they will not be harmed, become cooperative, and often openly relieved. Their intelligence value increases exponentially when they are treated according to international law." Interrogators learned that kindness was a more effective tool than coercion, that a well-fed prisoner who had been treated with basic human decency was far more likely to provide accurate information than one who had been brutalized. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Deutsch, who oversaw prisoner interrogations in the Pacific Theater, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The Japanese soldier arrived expecting hell and found instead something his military experience had never prepared him for. Bureaucratic indifference mixed with casual kindness. We did not torture because we did not need to torture. We had enough food, enough space, enough resources to treat prisoners as a minor administrative concern rather than a moral crisis." The numbers tell part of the story. By war's end, approximately 41,000 Japanese military personnel had been taken prisoner by American forces, a tiny fraction compared to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs, but significant given the cultural prohibition against surrender. Of those, post-war interviews revealed that more than 70% reported being shocked by their treatment, with many describing the experience of receiving clean clothes and washing facilities as the moment they began to question what they had been told about the enemy. One prisoner, Hiroshi Funasaka, captured on Bougainville in 1944, later wrote, "When they gave me soap and showed me where to wash, I wept. Not from gratitude, but from confusion. I had been ready to die. I had been certain I would be tortured. The soap made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore." The ideology begins to crack. For many captured Japanese soldiers, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. They had been taught that death was preferable to surrender, that the emperor's enemies were barbaric, that Japan fought for honor while America fought for materialist greed. Yet here they were, alive, clean, fed, while their own comrades starved in jungle foxholes, while their own officers beat them for minor infractions, while their own supply lines failed, and their own government sacrificed them in suicidal banzai charges. Some prisoners attempted suicide even after capture, unable to reconcile their continued existence with their sense of honor. Others retreated into silence, refusing to acknowledge the reality around them. But many gradually began to reassess. They began to notice things. The American guards ate the same food they did, better food, in fact, than what many Japanese officers had eaten before capture. The camps had electric lights, running water, medical facilities. Letters from home were allowed, though few wrote, ashamed to admit they still lived. The soap, the towels, the clean clothes, these mundane objects became evidence in an involuntary trial of everything they had believed. If the Americans were supposed to be demons, why did they provide medicine? If Japan was winning the war, why did the prisoners eat better than the soldiers? If the emperor was divine and his cause just, why did the system that opposed him seem so much more capable of caring for human life? The transformation was not universal and not immediate, but it was real. American intelligence officers noted that Japanese prisoners, after several months in captivity, often became vocally critical of their own military leadership, not out of coercion, but from genuine disillusionment. They had expected brutality and found bureaucracy. They had expected torture and found indifference. They had expected death and found soap, the weight of abundance. What the Japanese prisoners encountered was not merely humane treatment, but the visible manifestation of American industrial and agricultural might. The United States was so wealthy, so productive, that it could afford to feed and clothe its enemies to a standard higher than many nations could provide for their own citizens. This was not altruism, it was surplus. The camps operated on the overflow of a system so abundant that caring for prisoners represented a rounding error in the military budget. For soldiers who had fought on rations of rice and dried fish, who had watched comrades die of malnutrition and disease, who had scavenged abandoned equipment and counted bullets, the casual abundance of American POW camps was psychologically devastating. One prisoner, interviewed after the war, described being given a chocolate bar by a guard and sitting in his barracks, staring at it for an hour, unable to comprehend how an army at war could waste such luxury on a captured enemy. The soap was industrial, mass-produced, identical bars stamped out by the thousands in factories that ran day and night. It smelled clean, chemical, modern. It represented a system that could turn raw materials into consumer goods with such efficiency that even prisoners of war received them as a matter of routine. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to officers hoarding supplies, to corruption and scarcity, and the brutal hierarchy of military life, this casual distribution of basic goods suggested a fundamentally different kind of society, one where abundance was assumed, where human dignity was cheap because resources were plentiful. The letters that were never sent, most Japanese prisoners never wrote home. The shame was too great, the admission of survival too painful. But in the camps, they wrote to each other, they kept diaries, they whispered in the barracks at night. These documents, recovered after the war, reveal men grappling with profound philosophical crises. They had been told that the American way was corrupt, that democracy was weakness, that Japan's spiritual purity would overcome material advantage. But here they were, prisoners of that material advantage, beneficiaries of a system they had been taught to despise. One diary, entry dated August 1945, shortly after the Emperor's surrender broadcast, reads, "I do not understand what I am supposed to feel. They gave us soap. They gave us clothes. They treated our wounds. We ate better as prisoners than as soldiers. The Emperor says the war is lost. I am not surprised. I have been eating their food for 9 months. I knew." Another prisoner, in a letter to a fellow captive that was intercepted and preserved by camp administrators, wrote, "My father told me that Americans were devils without culture or honor, but devils do not give you soap. Devils do not care if you are clean. I think perhaps we were told lies, or perhaps the world is more complicated than we were taught to believe. I do not know what to think anymore." The epilogue of soap. The war ended, the prisoners went home or tried to. Many found that Japan did not want them, that survival was seen as a greater shame than death in service to the emperor. Some stayed in the United States, quietly building new lives far from the homeland that considered them tainted. Others returned and never spoke of their captivity, carrying the secret of soap and clean clothes like a wound that never healed. But the symbol remained. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and reassessed its militaristic past, the stories of POW treatment became part of a larger reckoning. The soap was not just soap, it was evidence that propaganda had lied, that the enemy had been human, that the ideology that sent millions to die was built on a foundation of manufactured hatred and deliberate distortion. The white bars of soap stamped with English letters, distributed by the thousands in camps across the Pacific, represented something the Japanese military could not acknowledge: that abundance and human dignity could coexist, that a nation did not have to brutalize its own people to be strong, that the choice was never between honor and survival, but between systems that valued human life and systems that treated it as expendable. In the end, the most powerful weapon America wielded against Japanese indoctrination was not bullets or bombs, but towels and soap, the mundane evidence that everything the soldiers had been told was a lie. They came expecting torture and found laundry. They came prepared for death and received clean clothes. And in that gap between expectation and reality, an entire ideology collapsed, bar of soap by bar of soap, one confused soldier at a time. The rain still fell on Luzon that January night in 1945, drumming against canvas and mud. But inside the tent, a Japanese soldier held soap in his trembling hands and began, slowly, to wash away more than just the dirt of battle.